Good morning, Kitty. How are
Good.
you? Can we do a quick audio check?
Sure. I'd also like to do just a quick check on share to make sure that I don't
Sure
have too
thing.
many things open.
Sure thing. I did just see your video on and I can hear you well. I did just make you a presenter if you want to try to share your screen. Perfect.
Yeah, but you don't want my whole screen.
Correct.
So let me go back. Let me see where's no, I don't want to leave the meeting. So how do I get, oh, there we go. Stop sharing screen. Okay, so how do I just share the, because this is different from when we did the test run.
So you can choose to share just the application of PowerPoint if you would like, instead of your full desktop. That's always an option as well.
Right, but when you gave me the share, it only gave me the option to share my desktop.
Let's try that again. Okay, Kitty, go ahead and try again.
There we go.
Perfect.
Okay. That's what I needed to make sure. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Now, where's my...
Good morning, Amber. Can we do a quick audio check with you? I did see your video on, so that looks okay.
Yes, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you. Good morning, Joe. How are you?
Good morning. Doing well. How are you?
Good. Okay, I can hear you and I can see you well, so I think we are good. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Morning, Jason. Can we do a quick audio check with you? I did see your video.
Excellent. Good morning. How you guys doing?
Good. Okay. Sounds good. Thank
Sound
you.
good? Yep. Let me fix the camera.
Perfect. Okay, we'll get started at 9:30. Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Good morning, Angelisa. Can we do a quick audio and video check for you? I cannot hear you if you are speaking. I can see you, Angelisa, but I cannot hear you. You can always try to log out and log back in if you want to, but your video looks good.
Ken Crumpler here. I'm just testing my mic. I've got good audio.
Yes, thank you.
All right, thanks. Going back on mute.
I can see you, Angelisa, but I still can't hear you. Check your settings. If you go up to the gear icon at the top right,
Casey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I had to call in.
Okay, yep, we can hear you.
It's a recording.
Hello all and welcome to the morning session on day 3 of the 2021 Virginia Highway Safety Summit. I'm going to go over a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Please remain muted for the duration of the session. We want to avoid background noises that could potentially interrupt our speakers. Secondly, please place all questions in the chat box. Our moderator will be monitoring the chat box and we will conduct a Q&A at the end of the session. Lastly, you have free control of your viewing mode. You can change the viewing mode at the top of your screen. It defaults to view everyone. We recommend changing that viewing mode to who's talking so you are focused on the speaker. As a final quick note, we will be recording this session and will be sending out the presentations once the summit is over. With that, I will now turn it over to our moderator for this session, Ms. Angelisa Jennings. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Perfect. Hello and welcome to everyone. I'm Angelisa Jennings, Deputy Director for Data Analysis and Planning in the Highway Safety Office at DMV. Thank you for joining our virtual Highway Safety Summit this morning. Our session is titled Crash Data to Problem ID in Pursuit of Answers. This session will provide different views for identifying and analyzing crash data to provide targeted, data-driven countermeasures for specific highway safety initiatives. We have 3 speakers for our session. I will introduce each speaker in order of their remarks, and then we will move to their presentations. As Casey says, if you have questions, please ask them using the chat feature, and we will respond to those questions after the presentations. Our first speaker today is Dr. Kathleen Hancock, or Kitty as we know her. She is an associate professor in civil and environmental engineering at Virginia Tech with over 35 years of experience in transportation engineering. Her areas of expertise include highway safety, data analysis and visualization, freight operations and planning, and geospatially enabling decision-making. Our second speaker will be Amber Elmore. Amber began her career in the records unit of the Chesterfield County Police Department in 2015. She has worked as a traffic analyst in the crime analysis unit for the last 4 years and now serves as a strategic analyst with the department. And our third speaker this morning is Second Lieutenant Jason Long. Jason has been with the Fairfax County Police Department for over 22 years and is currently serving as a supervisor of the Traffic Division's Traffic Safety Section. He oversees many areas within the division, including the Crash Reconstruction Unit, Motor Carrier Safety Section, the Traffic Safety Section, and several others. Jason has been the project director for the department's DMV Highway Safety Office grants for over 8 years and also assists in developing and enhancing the traffic safety strategies for the Fairfax County Police Department. Welcome to my speakers, and Dr. Hancock, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you, everybody. And I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts today on this very important aspect of crash data to problem ID. Excuse me if I cough during this. I'm recovering from a case of bronchitis after surviving a year of COVID, so bear with me. Excuse me. I apologize for the double slide there. I want to get started with talking about taking a look at crash data with respect to the year of 2020, which has been a very obviously unusual year, and how this can be incorporated into some of the analysis or considerations that you may have associated with determining where resources should be allocated for identifying problem areas. And as you can see, with fatal crashes and all crashes, going back and looking at 5 years prior to 2020, and please note the vertical axis does not start at 0, so don't misinterpret the 2015 and 2016 as being half of the other years of crashes. But as you can see, what we saw in 2020 was quite unusual in the fact that we had all crashes substantially lower than the average of the previous 5 years. So they're roughly 82% of what we've seen in the past. On the other hand, we see fatal crashes actually increased by 5% over that 5-year average. Now, because of the unique characteristics of the pandemic and what it did, I broke it down or looked at it by month, because obviously in March, the governor declared the state of emergency. And you can see, so the heavy maroon line is 2020, and the black line is the average of the 5 years. And you can see the distinct drop in fatal crashes shortly after the declaration. But at the same time, you see the increase that occurred substantially after there was some of the loosening. Similarly, with all crashes, you see a distinct, or not similarly, but opposing to this, with all crashes, you see a distinct drop in all crashes, which relates more to what we see with the reduction in VMT that occurred during the pandemic. Excuse me. So, and in the all crashes, you can see the brown line provides the 5-year average for that. Excuse me. So when we take a look at the statistics associated with this, where we're looking at the focus areas of the primary focus areas for the mitigation strategies that can take place, we can see, obviously with all crashes, 2020 versus 2019, and then looking at it versus the 3-year average and looking at it versus the 5-year average on the far right. And for all crashes in general, we see a drop, with the exception of unrestrained occupants. And that's actually a different story that I'm not going to tell today, sorry. But when we look at fatal crashes, we see an increase in all of the fatal crashes for all of the cases except for pedestrians from 2019 to 2020 and then over the 3-year average. But what's really of concern here, we see a large increase in teen driver crashes. Now, we've heard this nationally on the news, that this is not unique to Virginia. It's happening in multiple locations. But one of the things that I want to point out looking at this is if we look at the 3-year and the 5-year average, we see an increase over both of those, with the increase being somewhat less over the 5-year average, meaning if you were to look at the individual numbers, we would have probably a slightly decreasing amount of teen drivers over at least part of those 5 years. But then we see a big increase over the 3-year average, and then of course the largest increase over the previous year. So looking just at teen drivers and going back to the 2019, 2020, and then extending it into 2021, because there's, as we see, we start off with this increase over the period after the pandemic, the loosening of the initial order, we see an increase in almost all of the months that followed that. And then in 2021, we see a peak in crashes for April and May that is above everything, with the exception of the 2 months, January and June, which were the same as May. January of 2019 and June of 2020, which was the same as May of 2021. I did want to mention, looking at the teen drivers killed, you could see the difference between the number of fatal crashes and the drivers that were actually killed. Now, this does not include potential teen passengers, but those numbers were relatively small in during the pandemic period, as you can see. So breaking it down a little bit more by time, we see, excuse me, teen drivers in 2019 and 2020, even during the pandemic, we tend to see the peak occurring in the middle of the week. But we're looking now at 2021, and we see a shift to Saturday and Sunday and Monday. Now, these are percentages of the fatal crashes to that period, and 2021 is through May, the end of May, so the first 5 months of 2021. So when we break this down by time of day, we see for 2021 this increase in afternoon. There's very few in the morning, early morning and morning, and then an increase. And when we look at that by hour, we see peaks between 1 and 3 and between 7 and 10, so outside of the dinner hour. One other note that came up when I was reviewing the data by time of day is when I was looking at nighttime crashes, the difference between daytime and nighttime wasn't that big between the 3 different time periods that we were evaluating. But during the night in 2021, there seems to be an increase of, and to the point of over 3/4 of the crashes that occur at night were in unlighted conditions. And I'll get back to this in just a minute when I talk about driver action. So now we take, after get a hand, excuse me, a handle on sort of the, when crashes are occurring, going back and looking at it by the categories, we see increases across the board between 2019 and 2020. Between 20 and 2021, there are some decreases, but the numbers are pretty small. But the piece that I want to go back and look at is this increase in speed-related fatalities that occurred with that peak that we saw in April and May. And excuse me, it's not as large as some of the other increases, but when we look at the numbers of crashes, it does make up a pretty large percentage. And I think there is, at least in the news, a perception that teen drivers were doing the speeding. And so I wanted to explore this just a little bit more. But before we get to that piece, I wanted to give you a little bit of background on the age of the teen drivers, because this is important considering that for the period of time in the pandemic that there was a shift, number one, in the experience that drivers had, whether they were no longer driving to school or no longer driving to sporting events or those types of things. But also there was a shift in drivers' licensing, the education and the actual licensure of the drivers, which affected the 16 and 17-year-olds primarily. But we see a little bit of a shift from the 2019 age group from 18 to 17 and 19 when we look at the 2021 crash data. Now, the injury crashes involving teens, there wasn't a big change. So there wasn't too much that we needed to worry about there. When we break it down by age and gender, there's a lot of information in this slide, in this particular slide, and you can see I combined it with both the age and gender of the teen driver in the crash, but also pulling out how many teen drivers were actually at fault. And I'll come back to this in a minute, because you see in 2019, 80% were at fault. In 2020, it dropped to 73.5%, but in 2021, in the first 5 months, it actually dropped to 61%, indicating that there's 39% that were not at fault. And so is there a potential shift based on the lack of experience that we saw during COVID of their driving, that they're just not able to respond that well? I did want to, when we look at the specific teen driver actions, I did want to put this up here because there has been a lot of discussion about distraction in teen driving. But when we look at the actual indication from the officer of whether distraction was involved for these 3 years, this is what we see. And yes, there were 10 in 2019, but they really weren't, it was fatigue and passengers and other. But cell phone really does not show up as an issue with what the officer is seeing as distraction. This is crashes. This is not regular, their normal driving behavior. So it's a little difficult to extract from here, but I did want to bring this up and point it out. But when we get to the other teen driver actions involved in fatal crashes, the thing that stood out was, again, this no improper action. Okay, so in 2021, when we see that peak in April and May, the number of drivers who are not at fault increases. The other piece from this chart that I wanted to bring out is the failure to maintain control, which is a big catch-all, and there is some speed-related activity involved in that. But we take a look just at April and May, and we see that 8 of the drivers that were involved in those crashes, fatal crashes, were not doing anything wrong. 9 of them were indicated as failure to maintain control. And of those 9, 3 of them were traveling above what the officer considered the max safe speed. And so, it's a judgment call on whether they were doing things, from their perspective, whether they were driving at the appropriate speed or not. Now, of these, 3 crashes involved speeding by non-teen drivers, and 1 involved a bicycle. So, sorry, what we're seeing is not as big of a problem in the speeding as originally in the categorical table that I showed, that was implied by that 60%. It actually is smaller with the speeding issue. There were only 4 teen drivers that were speeding during the April and May timeframe. Now, I want to do a pivot and briefly talk about location of crashes, because I'm going to turn this over to one of my compatriots at Virginia Tech to finish up this presentation. But when we look at categorical locations, we see rural and urban on the right with the pie charts, that gives the general breakdown of all crashes. When we look at it by month and go over to the April and May, we see a spike in rural crashes. So that particular period, there was an increase in drivers in the rural areas that were involved in fatal crashes. Roadway type, there's an increase in two-way not divided roads. Relation to roadway, there's not a big difference, although we see fewer within intersection and much more on the roadway. And then roadway impact location, again, it's not that big of a difference between the 3 years as to where on the roadway occurred. So when we start adding specific crash location, this is what I think most of you are used to seeing, is the schematic map showing number of crashes, and in this case, the blue is total crashes. So number of teen crashes by jurisdiction with the fatal crashes located so that you can see this. At this point, I want to turn it over to Joe Newman, who works with me at CGIT, and he is going to finish out the presentation talking in more detail about location.
All right. So just as a quick review, the data that we're talking about here is from the FR300, and it has been processed by a team here at Virginia Tech. We've been working with the Highway Safety Office for almost 10 years, and we look at each individual crash as reported through the TREAD system, and our team goes through and identifies the intersection that's referenced, the distance and direction away from it, compares it to the latitude and longitude provided, as well as examines the diagram, reads the narrative, and any other location information in the FR300. Our team then creates a point to best represent the location described by the officer, and then assigns attributes from the authoritative data sources in Virginia, so from VGen, VDOT, and the Federal Highway Administration. We want to have standardized attributes to best describe the location of these crashes. And again, we've been doing this for almost 10 years, so we now have a very comprehensive data set that we can start to do analysis with in a complex manner. Here, just showing all of the crash locations since 2018 as an example. But this is not necessarily something you can comprehend, so we need to be more specific on how we look at crash locations. So in the example that Dr. Hancock showed with crashes across Virginia, only showing fatal crashes, to take that a step further, here we're showing a density of all crashes since 2018. And this is just in Richmond as an example. And this density is using time decay. So older crashes have slightly less weight in the density calculation. And we're doing this as a simple, very simple method to try to account for any mitigation strategies that have occurred over the past few years in the context of highway safety. And we're also symbolizing all crashes here. Black dots represent property damage, brown dots are injury crashes, the yellowish gold is serious injury, and red dots are fatalities. So to take this even more specific, looking at the driver action, we can do a similar density with the time decay, but here we're showing all crashes that were reported as failed to maintain proper control. So we want to be able to create tools that allow you to look at specific cases that you want to explore and build mitigation strategies accordingly. And we can highlight areas with specific times. So here I'm highlighting with a contour interval the high density of 2020 over the density of crashes from 2018 to 2021. So we're comparing the areas of high crash rates relative to longer time periods. And this is a feature that we've used in the status report cards that are distributed through the Highway Safety Office. So hopefully you've seen this before, and if not, please follow up with the Highway Safety Office. And again, to follow up with Dr. Hancock's presentation, we have here looking at specifically teen drivers that failed to maintain proper control in the Richmond area from 2018 to 2021. And so here we just wanted to highlight, with the standardized location information and the complete data that's within the FR300, we can start to be very specific about the maps and analysis that we're doing in any given location throughout Virginia. And just wanted to give a quick example and highlight the importance of the location information that's provided for each crash. And then on the analysis side, try to show some new opportunities on how we can be even more specific looking at crash location data. And I'll turn it over from here.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hancock and Joe, for that presentation. And we will now move to Ms. Amber Elmore for her presentation.
All right, good morning. All right, so I'm gonna get started talking about crash location analysis and how we do that as a police department. I myself, I graduated from VCU, where shortly after I started working for Chesterfield Police Department. When I began with the department, I worked in our records unit, and part of my job there was actually reviewing our TREDS reports prior to submitting them to DMV. So I have been on every side of TREDS as far as knowing the depth of the information that's there and how important that location data is that is put into those crash reports. So when I was in the records unit, I then moved to become our traffic analyst, and then later moved on to become the strategic crime analyst here in the department. So when I first started as the traffic analyst, I was quickly confronted with the question of, are we looking at traffic data the right way? And is there a better way to look at that traffic data? Now, I will say, I don't have an engineering background. I'm not a traffic engineer. And truth be told, I'm not that great at math. But what I am really good at is putting data in context. And that's the role of an analyst. It's to look at all the data that's out there and put it into a context to be able to explain to our commanders what's empirically good, what's empirically bad, what do we need to look out for, and what can we do something about. So what we want to do is look at how we can define good and bad in regard to crash locations and convey that assessment to our commanders so that way they can make informed enforcement decisions. So through this presentation, I want to focus on the methods of crash location analysis that we use here at Chesterfield County Police Department, the benefits of each. I also want to emphasize the importance of precise geolocation data in regards to traffic analysis and what can be surmised based on just the location of crashes. All right. So here is a screenshot from our TREDS website that I'm sure many of us have spent some time in. So if you go under TREDS and under the reporting section, there's an option to look at high crash locations for your jurisdiction. So this is going to be the high crash locations for Chesterfield County for 2019. I filtered it out to non-interstate crashes. For our department, Virginia State Police handles a lot of the interstate crashes. So we handle the non-interstate crashes and the enforcement on our roadways here in the county. So this map is based on clusters of crash locations for 2019. As you can see, most of our clusters are going to occur on our main roadways through the county. That northernmost stretch that starts at Midlothian and heads east towards Richmond City, that's going to be Midlothian Turnpike Route 60. Slightly south of that is Route 360, Hull Street Road, that goes through, kind of cuts our county through the middle. And then further kind of to the right of your screen to the east is Route 1. We do have two high crash locations that occurred along Route 1. So Next, I want to take a moment to dive into our #1 crash location for the county and how we look at it from a law enforcement perspective and try to see what we can derive out of that for causes of crashes at that location. All right, so this is our #1 crash location for 2019. It's the intersection of Commonwealth Center Parkway, which kind of runs from the right hand of your screen and then upwards towards the left. That's going to be running north south, slightly canted. And then the intersection with Hull Street Road, which runs east-west throughout our county. This cluster contains 45 crashes that occurred in 2019. So we can see just how precise that location data is for this particular intersection. And based off the locations of the crashes, we as law enforcement can make a few judgments in regards to enforcement strategies. So again, this is from law enforcement perspective, not necessarily from a roadway improvement perspective. So it's going to be probably very different than what VDOT might see when they look at the same map. So our officers do note issues that they see with roadway improvements, but we just want to highlight areas where we might be most effective in doing some sort of enforcement there. So looking at this map, firstly, you can see that most of the crashes occur within the queue that forms leading to the intersection. So if we're looking at eastbound Hull Street here, you can see this cluster of crashes that occur as you're approaching the intersection. And we also see the same type of clustering activity westbound, again, approaching that intersection that's controlled by a stoplight. So given the total number of crashes that occur in this cluster, very few are actually within the stop bars of the intersection. So for law enforcement, this would allude to the fact that they're not necessarily due to improper turning at this intersection or disregarding of the traffic signal. It's more likely that these crashes are being caused by just the queue, and primarily it's going to be rear end crashes at this location. So it's a very high volume intersection. So from a law enforcement standpoint, it might not necessarily be a great candidate for enforcement. Also, we looked at the speed relatedness of the crashes in this location, and only 5 of the 45 appeared to be speed related. So again, doing a speed targeted enforcement at this location might not be a positive way to reduce the number of crashes. And lastly, the types of crashes. If you look in the upper right hand corner, there's the crash legend for the crash types. Property damage crashes are highlighted in green, injury crashes in blue. If you look, overwhelmingly, the crashes at this location are property damage crashes. So again, they're going to be your low speed rear end type collisions that occur here. That although, we want to do anything we can to mitigate the total number of crashes, it's not necessarily something from an enforcement standpoint as far as placing an officer there that would really make a great impact at this location. So next I want to take a look at another intersection that's along Hall Street Road in our jurisdiction. This one is going to be further east. It's the intersection of Hull Street and Chippenham Parkway. I'm sure our partners at VDOT are very familiar with this intersection. So this cluster of crashes, as you can see is marked there with the 12, isn't even in the top 10 highest crash clusters in our jurisdiction. However, it's one that we pay attention to. This location had 22 crashes within this cluster for 2019. Now, if you look at the precise location of these crashes, they're far different than what we saw for the previous intersection. There's not the crashes that occur in the queue leading up to it. Instead, most of them are within the stop bars. You see that cluster within the cluster that's circled in red there that occurred right there in the middle of the intersection. So the map, this is straight out of Treads, and the mapping in Treads is based on a Google map. So we're able to even take a closer look at the location of these crashes and make some judgments that way. So this is where the work that they do at Virginia Tech as far as placing these crashes at their precise locations become very important to us as law enforcement. So this next shot is going to show you what that looks like in Street View. So this is, again, just a Google Map product. You take your little man in the corner, drop him down the street, and this is what it looks like in Street View. What you're looking at particularly is we are in the eastbound lanes facing towards the city of Richmond. Where that white truck is, he's entering onto southbound Chippenham. So the dots that are on the map even translate into the street view, and you can see that cluster of crashes is still in front of that stop bar of the eastbound lanes. What's also notable when we think back when we compare to what we saw at the Commonwealth Center and Hall Street intersection, the previous intersection was mostly green dots. With this intersection, we see more injury crashes noted in blue and a fatal crash that occurred in 2019 at this location noted in red. I'm just going to give you another look at this. This is that same intersection. We are now facing westbound. So from the direction of this camera, we would actually be in oncoming traffic. However, the vehicles that are traveling westbound would be to the right, kind of where that school bus and that silver Ford is. So if you look at the location of the school bus, just above it is where the traffic signal is. Just that way we're all kind of sharing the same perspective of this. So as you see that cluster is within these lanes, most of these crashes occurred when vehicles traveling in the lane of travel where the school bus and that silver Ford are attempting to make that left-hand turn onto southbound Chippenham through the intersection. At the time that this occurred, this was not a protected turn. VDOT has worked on making improvements to this location. So from an enforcement perspective, this location becomes a much greater candidate for traffic enforcement. We have a greater severity of crashes that we can make an impact on. Also, it appears that failure to yield to oncoming traffic is part of the issue with the crashes at this location. And I did want to highlight, this is from a news article in 2019, that VDOT did make changes. They worked to adjust the lanes and do a more protected turn in that location. So when we look at this same location from 2019 compared to 2020, we do see fewer crashes in 2020. I know that overall 2020 we had fewer crashes than the year previously, so it's still yet to be seen what the total impact will be, but it's at least promising that the roadway improvements are showing that there are fewer crashes in this location. So the precise crash location data allows law enforcement to make these sort of enforcement judgments just by looking at these crash maps. For us, this is invaluable. Like I said, as an analyst, my job is to put things in context. Just show the commanders kind of what's performing as we would expect it to and what's not meeting those expectations, and to make suggestions of where we can conduct enforcement. Our resources are not unlimited. We only have so many officers who are also at the same time responding to calls for service. So we want to make sure that we're giving our commanders kind of a most bang for their buck sort of approach to this enforcement. So that way they can make a data-driven decision of where we can actually impact change at. We want to make sure that we're being good stewards of the public's trust and that we're maintaining the safest roadways that we can. So there's some advantages and disadvantages of looking at these high crash locations just based on the raw number of crashes that occur. The advantages is that it gives us a large data set to analyze. When we have those densities and clusters of crashes, we can make really good assumptions just based on the raw number of crashes. It also gives us a good point of comparison. If you have 45 crashes at a location, it's really easy to start drilling down to what are the similarities, what are the differences. It also gives us the abilities to target high opportunity areas. If we select an intersection that had 20 crashes and we're able to reduce the crashes by 50%, we've now prevented 10 crashes. So that gives us a really high opportunity to influence change in these areas. Also, the advantage is high visibility enforcement. If we're going to target locations that are on our major roadways, not only are we being successful in traffic enforcement, but we also we might be deterring other crimes just by being, in the public's view that they're able to see that we're out there conducting enforcement. There are some disadvantages by looking through only the lens of crash location and the total number of crashes. One of which, with everything good that comes with being focused on the major roadways, there's a possibility that we might be missing smaller areas that might be better enforcement candidates. So like I said, when I came into the unit in 2017, I was quickly asked, is there a better way to look at crash location data? These high crash locations that we've looked at have been very similar year over year. We kind of know that Hull Street and Commonwealth Center is going to be a high crash location. We know other intersections in our county that are high volume locations that are going to have a high number of crashes. So the challenge becomes, how do we extrapolate out the smaller locations that we can maybe do something about? One example I like to use is Old Hundred and Otterdale. That was an intersection that VDOT was working on an improvement plan on, we as a police department knew it was a problem intersection. We had had a fatal, multiple serious injury crashes at that location, but because it was a smaller intersection without the high number of crashes, without the high amount of traffic, it was harder to extrapolate it out in our data as to why it's important to pay attention to this. So what we're trying to do is to look at intersections such as that one at Otterdale and Old Hundred, as well as others that are emerging, to see is there something as a police department that we can do to influence some sort of change at that location. So how did we do that? We started looking at VDOT's publications. So every year VDOT publishes its daily traffic volume estimates report. This is the front page of the report for Chesterfield County. Again, I'm not a traffic engineer, but by using this report as well as other VDOT data sets, we're able to take our crash data and to put it into some sort of context to give us some sort of point of comparison to compare these high volume intersections posed to these smaller intersections that also warrant our attention. So what's that look like? All right, this top chart shows our total crashes based on the raw number of crashes, what our highest intersections were. I do want to note that we typically look at things in regards to the precise intersection it occurred at, whereas the DMV and TREDS data looks at it in more of a cluster view, so the numbers are going to be slightly different. But this is the way that we've looked at our data previously. So as we see, Midlothian Turnpike and Woolridge had a high number of crashes in 2019, but towards the right, you can also see the annual average daily traffic for that location. So it's a very high volume intersection. This data came from a VDOT data set that is available through Tableau. They've recently, I think, moved on to Power BI, but this is just data we worked with a couple years ago. So we worked with this annual average daily traffic to try to normalize what that crash number means. So if we have 20 crashes at a high volume intersection, how does that compare to a lower volume intersection? Again, not a traffic engineer. So I know that VDOT looks at this data over long-term plans in regards to roadway improvements. Our purpose was to look at it from that law enforcement standpoint and try to determine where the changes are. So if we have an intersection that we can quickly do something about, are we able to notice that change in a fast manner? So we update this every quarter just to try to adjust our approaches to our highway safety. So this next chart is going to show what our top crash locations were based off crash rate. Here we are. All right, so as I mentioned before, Old Hundred and Otterdale is one of those intersections that VDOT was working on an improvement plan on. Anecdotally, our officers have known that that's a problem intersection. I actually had an officer write me like a 2-page email of why that intersection was a problem. But because it's a lower number of crashes, we were never able to get it to kind of rise to the top of our data. So by pairing the crash data with the VDOT AADT data, we're now able to show empirically, like, yes, this is a problem. So we wanted to align with what VDOT was already, VDOT already knew, what DMV knew with their crashes. We wanted to align our enforcement to where we can have the greatest impact. So like I said, we update this regularly. We show our commanders both of these looks. It's important to show them what the total crash locations are, just the raw number of crashes, as well as what the high crash rate locations are. So they get this look every quarter to determine for that quarter where our enforcement strategies might be best placed. So we want to place officers where they can make the most difference, whether that be at a large intersection, such as the Hall Street and Chippenham, where the officer might impact drivers not yielding to traffic, or whether that be the smaller intersection like Old Hundred and Otterdale. If having an officer there will slow drivers down enough to make them think twice before turning across traffic, that's what we want to do. It's not necessarily the goal of issuing tickets, but if we can reduce or eliminate crashes at a problem intersection, then that's what we want to do. So in reference to Old Hundred and Otterdale, like I said, it was something that we knew anecdotally was a problem intersection, but we're just having trouble extrapolating that out in our crash data. So during the same time that we were looking at this, also the Chesterfield County Department of Transportation, as well as VDOT, were also looking at the same location. So it's helpful, Neil, to kind of be in the same playbook that they are and at least kind of have some sort of frame of reference as to, the locations that they're looking at and how maybe us as a law enforcement agency can have an impact on those same locations. So lastly, I just want to emphasize that the enforcement resources that we have at the police department are limited and need to be data driven. I'm very thankful to work for a department that listens to the analyst and is willing to make those data driven decisions, whether it be something that's expected or not expected. Our commanders have been very receptive to this sort of data driven enforcement strategy. Secondly, the precise crash data location is invaluable. I know from my time working in records, sometimes when an officer puts in the crash location, it's not where we would want it to be. There's challenges they face on the technology side of things. But having it go through that secondary location and being able to locate it as closely as the lane, that's huge for us from an analysis standpoint. And lastly, there's so many opportunities for further data enrichment. As a police department, this is something that we're excited to explore and see what the capabilities are, whether that be pairing crash data with further VDOT data and seeing how law enforcement can play a role in that. So that is all I have, and thank y'all very much today.
Thank you, Amber, for that wonderful presentation. We will now move to Second Lieutenant Jason Long, and Jason, you may begin your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Angelisa. So I'm going to talk to you about the way that we sort of use TREDS and use that to do our data-driven traffic enforcement, particularly as it relates to us using our Highway Safety Office grant money. My name is Second Lieutenant Jason Long. I'm with the Traffic Safety Section here in Fairfax County. I've been doing this job for about 8 years, and over that time, I've learned that there's a lot of valuable information in TREDS, and that has really helped us narrow our focus when it comes down to our speed enforcement, our alcohol enforcement, and our pedestrian and bicycle safety enforcement. So some background about Fairfax County. It's Northern Virginia, just next to DC and Arlington County. It's about 399 square miles, just under 1.2 million people. And based off of the 2020 VDOT mileage table book, there are over 7,169 miles of VDOT maintained roadways within the county. The Fairfax County Police Department, we have a little under 1,500 sworn officers. And I do believe we were the last department, or if not the last, one of the last departments to fully transition to electronic crash reporting through TREDS. We finished that transition in summer of 2017. And so it's only been about 3 full years of crash data that we've been electronically submitting to TREDS. As part of that, we don't really have any local ownership of our crash data. And what I mean by that is that our records management system was implemented in 2010. When we transitioned to electronic reporting, we were already in the process of identifying a replacement for our records management system. So the resources to create some sort of interface between TREDS and our records management system were not expended because of our impending replacement of our records management system. So all of our crash data that we use comes from TREDS. We don't have any internal mechanisms to look at crash data. So we're going to look at what the benefits of data-driven enforcement are. And the first part, like Amber mentioned, is high visibility, and that's not necessarily driven by data, but when you're doing this enforcement, the high visibility is paramount. People driving through these corridors and these intersections need to see enforcement. They need to see police officers pulling people over. They need to see blue lights on the side of the road. But it's not the only part of a strategy. Enforcement alone does not solve crash problems. You have to be able to provide the educational material, the public awareness piece. You also have to have partnerships with your departments of transportation, be it VDOT or any sort of local county or city department of transportation. They're invaluable for helping fix these crash problems and to drive these crash numbers down. It does help to narrow the focus of your enforcement. Just throwing, you know, we're not, the staffing for our department is probably very similar to most departments out there. We are having a hard time retaining and hiring new officers. We are understaffed. There's a saying of doing more with less. Well, that doesn't happen. If you have less, you do less. So help more efficiently focus your enforcement efforts and get more efficient enforcement. You need to actually go where the crashes are. So this helps focus that enforcement and more efficiently use your resources as well as your officers. So we're going to look at how do you define the problem? How do you use this crash data to figure out where you're going to do this enforcement? This is 2019 crashes that were investigated by Fairfax County Police. There were 7,171 crashes in 2019. 32 of those crashes were fatal crashes that resulted in 33 fatalities, and there were just under 3,500 injuries involved in all of these crashes. As you can see from the map for the county, they're all over the county. So if you're in charge of a traffic unit or you're in charge of a district station where you want to address these crash problems, well, how are you going to, you can't just say, I'm going to go tackle 7,100 crashes. You have to narrow that focus and figure out where the problems are and what the best way to address those problems might be. So where do you start? You start with, one place is, the Highway Safety Office gives us a good template of where to start. Obviously, alcohol involved crashes, speed involved crashes, pedestrian and bicycle safety, occupant protection. Those are obviously highly represented in some of the injury and fatal crash numbers. Depending if your agency has a motorcycle safety issue or even a commercial motor vehicle issue. If you have an area where there's large numbers of commercial motor vehicle crashes, all of this data can be obtained through TREDS for your county, for your jurisdiction, your city, and you can find out where these hotspots are, and this will help you develop a traffic safety strategy to address those particular problems and be very narrowly focused to location and, again, to the type of problem. Like Amber said, if you have an intersection where you have a bunch of crashes, but they're really not enforcement related, that's probably not the best place to dedicate your resources to if enforcement isn't really going to affect those crashes in that intersection. So if you look at the Fairfax County numbers for 2019, our three biggest contributors to fatalities were alcohol, speed, and pedestrians. As you can see here, alcohol was involved in 45.4% of the fatalities, speed in 36.3%, pedestrians in 48.5%. Now, for some of the math majors out there, you could look at that and say, well, that doesn't add up to 100%. No, it doesn't. There are some, obviously some overlaps. You could have an alcohol and speed related fatality crash. You could have an alcohol and pedestrian fatality involved crash. So there is some overlap over these three, but these were the three largest contributors to fatalities in our county in 2019. And historically, throughout the years, these were the top three contributors to our fatalities. And then this will show you, this is a chart you can get from TREDS for your department to show you, and you can break down crashes based on any one of these types and more. And this is breaking them down by month. As you can see, for alcohol crashes in 2019, they happen all year round. There's a couple months that pop out like November, September, and March. But overall, we're seeing crashes, fatalities, and injuries pretty much equally represented throughout the year. Speed related, pretty much the same. You see some clustering and some increases in August and September. December as well, but overall there's not really a specific time where sort of speed crashes dip. They're pretty consistent throughout the year. So this helps identify that, yeah, there may be a problem that you need to address. There's not really a specific time frame to do it according to the month, but it does look like it is a year-round problem where enforcement can be done. So we still need to narrow that down a bit, right? So how else can we do that? Well, we can look at location, like Amber was saying, the top 10 or the top crash locations through TREDS, through the mapping tools. are very helpful to give you those clusters and to have a look at where those are. You know, there's obviously officers who have knowledge of the area, residents and community members who have knowledge of the area. Their complaints and their observations are very important in drawing attention to certain areas. Just be aware that, you know, both officers' knowledge and the community members' knowledge they're subjective. An officer might like a certain location to do enforcement for some reason, but that location might not really contribute much to an overall crash reduction strategy. The crash data, other data sources such as speed collection devices, if you have any sort of traffic counting devices that you deploy, or if you depend on your local Department of Transportation to provide that data. That data is also very, very important and invaluable in determining particularly speed-related crashes. Officers generally tend to not write a crash report and say that a driver was speeding unless they have very hard evidence that there was a speed issue there. As Kitty was saying earlier in the first presentation, a lot of the fail to maintain control action, driver actions, probably involve speed. So having some sort of speed measurement devices that you can deploy on a roadway to conduct surveys are very helpful in determining, especially speed data. And then when are you going to do this enforcement? Obviously, you know, day of week, time of the day, that kind of stuff is very important. We're not going to go out and do alcohol enforcement at, you know, 11 a.m. on a Tuesday morning because that's just not what we're seeing alcohol crashes. You're going to do that at different times. And in terms of alcohol crashes, this is an example that we use, that I've used. This area here is Clifton Road. It is a 2-lane, very windy, very old Virginia road, like I like to call it. It's a very scenic road through the western part of our county. Very hilly, very windy. Between Braddock Road up here in the north part of the map and 123, which is Ox Road down here on the further south into east, Clifton Road connects those two roads. If you count the crashes here, now these are all alcohol involved crashes for 2018. There was 11 crashes between the two stretches of roadway. There were 2 extra ones here on Newman, which are very close to the town of Clifton. There's a couple more up here on Braddock. As I was preparing to give some direction to officers that were working the saturation patrol under our Highway Safety Office grant, I was looking through our department's crash maps on treads, and I noticed this cluster of, or this corridor had this many crashes. I also noticed that Route 1 on the eastern side of our county, which is, as you can imagine, a very highly traveled roadway, several lanes, tens of thousands of cars a day on that road. The entire stretch of Route 1 from Alexandria to Prince William County had 7 alcohol-involved crashes. So I was trying to figure out why this section had more than 13, you know, more than almost double the amount of crashes as a major roadway that historically has a high number of crashes. And I was speaking to one of our members of our DUI squad about it. And I said, you know, this is weird that there was this many crashes on Clifton Road, but it makes sense. It's a cut through from Braddock to 123. Braddock Road is very heavily patrolled. 123 is very heavily patrolled. And so if you maybe did have a little bit too much to drink, you probably wouldn't want to drive down these main roads. You'd probably want to drive through these back streets. And the design of the road being what it is, and if you are impaired, it's a very difficult road to drive down as you're impaired. So this one officer on the DUI squad came up to me and he's like, you know, ever since you told me that, I've done some enforcement on Clifton Road whenever we're assigned out to that part of the county. And if you look at the, this is going to be the same map for 2019, as you can see the change. There were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, only 7 crashes. So within a year of one officer doing just some enforcement in this stretch of Clifton Road, it went from looking like that to looking like that. So this is an example of not just looking at a specific intersection or maybe just a small corridor, but looking at an overall corridor as a whole and how that crash data can be used to tailor your enforcement and reduce those crashes. on that stretch of the road. As we were saying, you can also use treads to break down crashes by day of the week, by a 3-hour window. This is alcohol crashes for 2019. As I was saying, we're not going to do alcohol enforcement on a Tuesday morning because we've had, Tuesday's our lowest day, and then 9 in the morning, there's only 6 alcohol crashes. Unsurprisingly, a majority of our alcohol crashes are from 9 p.m. to midnight and midnight to 3 a.m. And then the third one is from 6 to 9. So if you actually tally these numbers up between 6 p.m. and 3 a.m., 73% of our alcohol involved crashes occur. And no surprise here either, it's all Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. The Sunday being Sunday morning after midnight. This is a look at our pedestrian crashes. Again, you can't really see much of a, nothing really jumps out except for some reason Thursday was a very bad day in 2019. But overall, they're spread out very equally along the week, which makes sense. The other thing that also sort of makes sense is you see most of the crashes are happening early morning, early evening. As we all know, speed is a factor in pedestrian crashes, especially with the severity of injuries. And you can see that there were 3 fatalities between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. And then there were more overnight when the speeds can become higher. Also, this is, well, not here, but in most areas, this is before rush hour. This is sort of before rush hour up in Northern Virginia. But the speeds, obviously are higher before the main rush hour. People trying to get to work before traffic gets too bad. It's also dark. The visibility might not be as good. So looking at these 3-hour windows and these days of the week can help you figure out when this enforcement should take place and when your problem areas occur. Because of this, maybe your department can tailor sort of a swing shift because at this time of the day, 5 to 6 to 7 a.m., that's usually a changeover from midnight to day work officers. So having a couple officers out over that overlap can maybe help with some of the enforcement for that as well. And then again, these are some maps from our pedestrian crashes for 2019. As you can see little clusters that will pop up in small areas, and you can use that to say, okay, well, obviously on this part of Little River Turnpike in Annandale, there's several pedestrian crashes, there's 1 fatality. There's also some crashes on the roads leading into Annandale. And using that with your knowledge of the area, you have, especially in this area, you have a large commercial area here, another large commercial area here. You have apartments. So that is a recipe for a lot of potential conflicts with pedestrians and vehicles. And this is one particular area where we tend to do a lot of enforcement efforts. We did one in the spring based off of this map, and over a 2-hour period, we had about 10 to 12 officers, and we observed 61 different violations just in that 2-hour period in this stretch of 236. So these types of analysis of the maps and treads available in treads can definitely help you if you need to find areas to focus your enforcement on. The same thing for this area here in the Falls Church area of the county. This is Route 50 going through east to west through the county into Arlington. And once again, you can see we have several crashes in this area, including a couple fatalities. And in 7 Corners, which, if anyone's not familiar with that area, that is an area that was designed by a certified lunatic. Apologies if anyone from VDOT is on this call that designed that intersection, but that is an intersection with 7 different roads coming into it, different elevations, exits from 50 going on to Route 7, several different lights. And even as someone who worked that area for several years, it's still confusing to me. So it's very confusing for people that don't know where they're going and trying to get through there. So there are definitely challenges with enforcement in that area. But again, these maps can show where those hotspots are and can give you ideas of when to do your enforcement and where to do your enforcement. And then again, with finding and using the data from TREDS, there are some things to be aware of. There is a difference between, if you look at TREDS and you look at the maps under TREDS, you have an option of my department versus my jurisdiction. And that is, in some areas, that might not be that big of a difference, but for us in Fairfax, that's a huge difference. As I said in the beginning, there were 7,171 crashes investigated by Fairfax County Police. Those are crash numbers that I obtained using the My Department information. The My Jurisdiction information deals with all crashes that occurred within the boundaries of Fairfax County. And if you look up that number, you get 13,301 crashes. And why is that different? Well, My Jurisdiction takes the data from every agency within the county that submits crashes to TREDS. State police primarily work the interstates, and we have a lot of them up here. We also have 2 towns of Vienna and Herndon that have their own police departments that are responsible for their own roadways, where the county does not have primary responsibility there. And there's also a roadway that goes to Dulles Airport, where that is patrolled by mostly state police, as well as the Metropolitan Washington Airport Authority Police. Again, the county does not have primary responsibility on those roadways. So that, for us, is obviously a significant difference. If your county or your area does not have independent towns that have their own police departments, or does not have a lot of state police involvement, those numbers will probably be pretty similar. You can also, in these maps and in these tables, you can also single out specific roadways. And this map here, for example, is a map of all speed-related crashes on the Fairfax County Parkway. We know that that is an area that has high speeds, that has a lot of speed-related crashes, but we wanted to see exactly how high, not necessarily how high the speeds, but where the crashes are localized. And you can see in this map, there's some up here near the Herndon-Reston line. There's obviously a few here in a section around in the western part of our county, and then there's breaks in areas where you don't really see the crashes. So when we're tailoring our speed enforcement, which is what we did for several years, we used our speed overtime grants to specifically do enforcement on the Fairfax County Parkway. We could tell officers, well, don't do your enforcement here, do them here, or down south. And that's what we've done for a few years. So this is how we were able to do that. We were able to pull these maps up. We were able to pull up tables through TREDS to find out where these crashes are on the roadway. And so when you're doing that, with speed, it's not much of an issue with this. But when you look at involved versus at fault, if you're looking at alcohol-involved crashes, for example, that's going to show you every crash that had alcohol involved. It's not necessarily going to show you alcohol involved as part of the driver. If there are pedestrians that are impaired by alcohol, that's going to show up as an alcohol-involved crash. So just be aware of what you're looking at, especially as you saw earlier with the teen drivers. Teen drivers and being involved does not mean the teen driver was at fault. It just means that crash involved a driver that was between the ages of 15 and 19. And again, you can use any departmental data sources to help focus your enforcement, such as traffic or speed monitoring devices or internal record management system. For this particular part of the parkway, we have used speed collection devices to also help pinpoint areas where we have high speeds, particularly in this area of the county parkway. So based on the TREDS data and our internal data, we've looked at these crashes, and we've assigned our speed overtime to be done on the county parkway. So of course, with any program, you have to do an evaluation. Did it work? Were there a reduction of crashes? Is the community feedback positive? Well, people might come to you and say, hey, you know what? We had a problem here, and ever since we saw some enforcement there, that problem has gone away. Fewer arrests or summons issued. If you're out there and you're not finding the speeds, you're not finding the DUIs that you normally did, maybe actually what you're doing is working and getting these people to slow down or getting people not to drive impaired. If you are using your own data collection devices, are you noticing lower average speeds? Are you noticing a lower 85th percentile in speeds? And when you do your seatbelt surveys, are you noticing maybe higher seatbelt usage? Whatever you're doing, obviously you have, always you have to go back to see if it worked. So this is a chart of speed related crashes on the Fairfax County Parkway. And I don't know if it cut off the bottom here or not. If it did, I apologize. But in 2018, there were 42 crashes, speed related crashes on the county parkway. In 2019, there were 45. So you might say, well, that didn't work. The crashes went up. But the injuries in 2018 were 26, and in 2019 were 14. And the fatalities also dropped from 3 to 2. So one thing I can say about the Fairfax County Parkway is there were very high speeds on that roadway. Obviously, the higher speeds are associated with higher injury or more injuries and more fatalities. So by saying that while the crashes went up, the injuries dropped by nearly half, which I think is a success. And I think that shows that the enforcement was getting the very high speeds off of that roadway and getting the speeds down. The 2020, there was obviously an asterisk next to that year because of COVID, but the crashes went down to 36 and the injuries went down to 10. So hopefully, as we continue enforcement on there, we'll start to see the slower speeds are now going down, and then we'll see the crashes decrease as well. But seeing on a nearly 50% drop of injuries, I think would be a success for that enforcement and show that it needs to keep happening. And that is my presentation for today. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope it was helpful.
Perfect. I would like to thank all of our speakers for the insightful and valuable information you presented today. Each of you provided different perspectives into how you analyze and use our crash data in your daily decision making, while also providing good takeaways for all who are participating today. Let's go to our chat room for any questions. I see that my data manager has been doing a really good job in answering some of them already. And I'll give you a few more seconds in case you have any others. And while we do that, I want to make a few announcements. Of course, we've heard this, but I want to make sure we drill it home that for you to mark your calendars for the next Virginia Highway Safety Summit, which will be in person at the Hilton Alexandria Mark in Alexandria, Virginia, from May 3rd to May 5th, 2022, sorry. Also, a survey link to get your feedback on the summit will be sent to you after the conference, as well as presentations will be made available after the summit as well. One other thing, please, just a reminder that there will be an afternoon session today beginning at 1:30 p.m. on marijuana usage and its impact on traffic safety. So please join us at 1:30 today for that particular session. And I'm not seeing any additional questions. I'm getting some excellent presentations. Great job. So I think we have answered the call today for how we use our data successfully. Again, that's all that we have for right now, and thank you for joining us this morning.